In the annals of history, are there still universal mysteries to be solved? Were it not scrubbed from public view, were it still on the digital shelf, would you want to know? All it takes is a curious mind and perhaps the eye of an alchemist.
Welcome to the show. This is an incredible lineup today. Joining me here on the panel, I have Thomas, aka Paranoid American from Paranoid American Podcast. Also, we have Mario from Symbolic Studies and Heidi from the Unfiltered Rise podcast. And I'm Tim from Sixth Sensory Podcast. The way this came about, Heidi and I were doing a show where gold kept coming up. Gold use, alchemical gold, even gold used in particle colliders. And after the show, we thought it would be cool to do a show on the mysteries of gold.
Definitely.
And I'll just say this, and then I'll turn it over to you guys. Right before that podcast with Heidi, I had a guest on who mentioned the story of the golden calf. And in that story and other stories that I've since looked into, gold seems to take on this metaphysical role. And overall, I think historically, alchemically, symbolically, and maybe even esoterically, gold is this very alluring, enchanting topic. So I'm very interested to hear what you guys think. Who wants to kick this off?
Heidi.
All right. Well, I am Heidi Love from the Unfiltered Rise. I think it's interesting that gold is often used with a lot of Mormon stuff. I always take it to the Mormons because, I was one for so long. But they got it on top of all their temples. They also have, speaking of golden calves, they have golden calves in the baptismal font for the baptism for the dead. And so, yeah, let's not forget old Joe and his golden plates, but no one saw those. They seen them with their spiritual eyes. So, but yeah, definitely gold is always coming up. So I think it's an interesting dive for sure.
And I'll pop in. This is Thomas, aka Paranoid American. And I guess my relationship with the gold is a little bit weird. I don't have a lots of it, but I did grow up Roman Catholic, and I just remembered like all of the gold coated everything. So there was always like this intrinsic link in my mind, even before I even knew what I was looking at, that gold means God, or like gold is Jesus, or if I want to praise God in the best way possible, like this guy obviously, and again, Roman Catholic, this guy obviously loves stained glass windows and gold filigrees, and I got to go to the Vatican once and saw all the gold chairs. So clearly that was embedded in part of me. And then I am really big into electronics. So gold was always like gold tipped and gold plated everything, even though it's not as conductive as silver and copper, but it is kind of like third up there. And then finally, the concept of alchemical gold, I think, is probably the one that hits me the hardest, with gold maybe being like a philosopher's stone or some other version of things that you're trying to transmute into this other pure, better substance. So that's kind of like the trifecta for me. And then the Zachariah Sitchin stuff, where we're just like, on an alien ant farm mining gold for the aliens. I love that stuff too. So, I mean, there's endless things to talk about with this.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, it goes on. And this is Mario from Symbolic Studies. And obviously my perspective is through the realm of symbolism. And so clearly to me, there's a huge relationship with gold and the sun. And those implications are absolutely huge. And, one of the things actually years ago that I came across that always sticks with me when I think of gold symbolism is I have a few symbolic reference books, and they say that some cultures, I believe like in Central America, believed that gold, and maybe South America as well, that gold was the excrement of the sun god. And when you look at gold, gold nuggets, it kind of makes sense. And then later on, I found out that there's actually symbolism related to feces and gold as well. There's even like this little deity where he's kind of known as the money shitter, and he actually has gold coins that actually come out of his anus. And so there's a relationship with feces and gold that I did not expect. And so, but once I read it, it's kind of like just been seared in my mind. And I tend to think about it, but it makes a lot of sense, actually, either it being the excrement of a sun god or even from the sun itself that way. But a lot of times people like to say too symbolically that gold is sort of like condensed sunlight or condensed time even. And so it really is like it just like Thomas was saying, you know, its connection to God and everything else can't be sort of understated. But it seems as though people had a different relationship with gold during the Golden Age. So that's kind of another thing that we can talk about too, is this concept of the Golden Age and why was it referred to as the Golden Age? And then how did people look at gold back then? Because my understanding is there's kind of been a shift with how people perceive gold and how people actually use gold way back when versus today.
I think having a panel like this is great, specifically for a topic like this, because I didn't even come across gold as an excrement, like just that part of it maybe coming through the human body or whatever. I didn't really come across that. That's great. But going back to something that Thomas said, I'll just say that I found alchemy to be a huge part of this and just a huge part of the broader mystery behind gold. And Manly P. Hall said alchemy is a spiritual art and a divine secret science. So I listened to one of his lectures on esoteric alchemy, and he wasted no time in talking about how gold and the alchemists were put to death and persecuted because the rulers of the time, and I imagine all the rulers, they all wanted this secret to gold making. And so it's as if the moment the alchemist exposed his beliefs about gold, he immediately opened himself up to persecution. So I think gold is very much interwoven with alchemy. And I'll add this, Hall also said that he believed gold could be made and could be manufactured. I found that interesting.
Well,
Right.
there's one huge takeaway from Hall's earlier work, and there's a book called The Occult Anatomy of Man, and in this book he makes this this statement that seems so obvious in retrospect, but it blew my mind when I first heard it, and now it's like formed like one of the pillars in my belief, and that's that he was describing the seven seals, and not necessarily in biblical terms, but he was describing it in that seven seals would mean that you could read the Bible beginning to end as if it were like an anatomical reference to everything, where all of the disciples are parts of the human body and all of the movements are movements within the body. And then he said, okay, then you can take a step back and then you can read it all historically, and then you can start over and read it all geographically, and then basically that you could read like these master works seven different ways in seven different contexts, and they always make the same amount of sense. And that's kind of what separates it from just a collection of writings to something that's truly got some kind of like hidden code very deep inside of it. And I feel that the alchemical claims about transmuting other materials into gold and the philosopher's stone, it's got that same DNA where we could be talking about philosophy, we could be talking about literal gold, we could be talking about, you know, like at least seven different versions of quoted gold, and that's again why like this is such a rich topic.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, man. I love that. And it, you know, the number seven is so significant and it's insane, all of the different implications and septenary symbolism and everything else. But this idea that the number seven relates to cycles. So it corresponds with the chariot card, you know, in the tarot. And so there's always this sort of like movement and things like that that kind of comes with seven, but kind of completion too. And there, I know there's some alchemical processes. I know it's called Azoth alchemy is what I'm referring to, but there's like seven main steps to everything as well. And so this idea too that there's like seven main sort of spheres of existence corresponding with like the seven planets or seven gateways from, you know, this domain to like, you know, the etheric plane or the afterlife or whatever you want to say. So it fits in line with that, for sure. And then I believe too, isn't the alchemist and like the holy mountain, isn't he trying to transmute literal feces into gold? I haven't seen it in a long time.
And I to tag on to that too, just so we can put it all out there. There's also been like a lot of recent studies that because of water treatment plants using gold nanoparticles to neutralize odors, that there's literally hundreds of millions of dollars worth of real gold that could be mined from like just human sewage. I
Wow.
don't think anyone's found out a way to like efficiently extract that gold in that way, but it's there. Like that, them there are hills, you know what I mean? Like there's gold in them there are hills kind of thing. That might be the
Right.
next gold rush is like through sewage plants. So like the fecal gold link is like both ways. You know, you can invert it and it still remains the same.
That number 7 really stood out. I mean, I think there's also 7 different metals in alchemy, and they all have a planetary counterpart, or I think they call it a planetary influence. And with gold, it represents the sun, or vice versa. Silver, the moon. Copper, I think Venus, and then so on. So I'm just throwing that out there because I don't know. Maybe that number 7 is going to keep popping up in this. We'll see.
I would not be surprised at all, for sure. Related to alchemy and the philosopher's stone and things like that, one of the things that comes to mind is the idea that gold relates to hidden knowledge, right? And hidden treasure, basically. And so it fits right in line with that, because it's not like you're going to come across gold all the time. You know, you have to look for it and search for it, and it's a skill, and obviously it's highly sought after. One thing I'd like to say that I think is fascinating, and I just read this, so it's very new to me, but it's the idea that during the Golden Age, supposedly people had a different understanding of how to use gold and what gold was kind of meant to kind of do for humanity. And the basic belief is that if you're to believe that humanity went through some sort of fall, right? And there's a lot of myths and traditions that kind of suggest that there has been a fall of mankind, that we live in sort of a dark age, which is a, that we're completely separate from this golden age a long time ago. And what did this golden age actually look like? How did people treat each other and things like that? Who's really to say? But I am interested in kind of what people at least thought about all of this. But I just read from one of my favorite authors. His name is Rene Guénon, and he was basically saying that during this golden age, that gold was literally viewed as like a aspect of God, essentially, and that to hoard it or to claim it for yourself was really, really, really frowned upon, and that it was almost like trying to take away the sunlight from your fellow man or something along these lines. So they had this idea that gold basically belonged to God, if you will, and that it was for everybody, and that it wasn't actually meant to be possessed like on an individual level. It wasn't meant to be owned at all. And what he says is that when sort of the golden age had come and gone, and as man went through this fall, that's when people started wanting to take control over gold and possess it and start using it for their own sort of selfish desires or needs or what have you. And then man eventually started killing for gold. But that during the golden age, that they had a completely different sort of take on things. So again, this is new information to me. I think it's kind of fascinating. Is it a metaphor? Is this how it actually went down? I'm not really sure, but it's kind of a curious thing to think about.
There were I think there were several. You talked about an age of gold, and I think there were possibly several ages of gold, because I kind of approached this whole topic from the standpoint of alchemy, not for any reason. It's just that's just how this kind of went for me for in preparation for the show. But alchemy itself has gone through a process of death and rebirth, almost like a mineral that's being formed underground. And there are these periods of history where alchemy seems to have been laying dormant until an invading army comes through and rediscovers the alchemical texts. Like when the Arabs invaded Greek lands, they found all these interesting books and they started practicing alchemy again. And you see a rise in this obsession with what Thomas mentioned earlier, the philosopher's stone, and making gold. And the intrigue of turning a base metal into gold comes out of the discovery of these old books. So alchemy and this quest for gold, I think, experiences these revivals. Like the moment it fades into obscurity, it comes alive again through a new generation. And I appreciate that. I appreciate its refusal to die.
But you're talking about
Absolutely.
an alchemical process, a thing that's called the blackening, and that's essentially when something becomes its like most putrid state, and you have to like lock it away in darkness and just let it go through its like final transformation process until it comes back up. And if you want to apply that to when you're talking about armies coming through and like reinvigorating these old stories, I think you could almost say that like once it becomes ubiquitous, it loses a little bit of its like novelty, for lack of a better word, right? So once like everyone knows about alchemy and everyone's doing it and like everyone's claiming that they know how to make gold, it almost becomes this weird like snake oil thing, and then it
Yeah.
loses favor, and then it turns into a hoax thing. And then what
Mhm.
happens is that once it's completely shamed almost out of existence, it's like own blackening culturally, then the only people that even want to touch it with like a 10-foot pole are people that are like really, really into it. So now all of a sudden you get this resurgence, and it's kind of like religions are never founded by like lukewarm advocates. It's usually like the fanatics, right? The fanatics are the ones that can actually found a religion, because otherwise it would just kind of like fizzle out. So you almost have that same death and rebirth cycle in terms of interest and fanatics that kind of like push alchemy in this new wave. And it's such a meta fractal thing, right? Like even the practice of alchemy itself must die and be reborn constantly.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense too. And I've even heard too that just recently, this is a newer thing for me as well, is kind of realizing or learning that what we consider alchemy today, I think it was Jung who kind of like put on the map sort of more of like the internal alchemy and things like that. But that came from sort of a physical alchemy, chemistry background. But that actually came from more of the internal alchemy, that the original alchemy was always internalized, and it was almost more of a spiritual, psychological kind of alchemy that you were actually working on. And then when people basically became more material in nature, that's my personal perspective. I think that we kind of live in a very solarized world, actually, and that a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the sun. You know, people go by a solar-based system today. Astrology, modern astrology, is the path of the sun. It's the ecliptic. And so I see that we've gone through these different symbolic sort of ages. But I think sort of in the modern world, in this sort of solar age, people tend to look at things in a more material kind of way, in a more physical kind of way, less so in a spiritual kind of metaphysical way. And so to me, I could see that alchemy turned wholly into this sort of physical sort of practice, right? And less so about what's actually happening, maybe perhaps within or on a spiritual level. But I see that there's a correspondence there regardless. And I've heard people say that, you know, if you want to really learn how to do personal, spiritual, inner alchemy, get yourself in the lab and actually start working with real substances and stuff, because you're going to learn all of these different lessons and layers to, you know, all of this. So anyways, something to consider. Just the alchemical sort of idea going through different phases, pretty much, as you guys are talking about, and probably different sort of like, you know, trends and stuff within all of this. I thought it was really interesting. I read in one of my books preparing for this that there was this alchemist, and one of his sort of underlings, his assistant, put gold sort of flakes, you know, in what he was trying to transmute. He was trying to transmute one of these base metals into gold. And so he wanted to like make his master happy and think that he actually had done the thing. So he put gold at the bottom of his little flask or whatever. And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing too. I actually want to know a little bit more about that story if there's more history there.
He was like gaslighting the alchemist, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
It's like there's a spiritual bridge here. I don't know if that's the best term to use, but a bridge between uh, practicing alchemy and this internal conceptualization of alchemy. And I think Jung did a lot to sort of frontier that. He brought in dreams. He comes to this subject of alchemy. It's already super symbolic. Jung tacks on dreams and consciousness. And in the Red Book, he talks about how Philemon tells him that it would be better if Jung's knowledge of magic die with him, go to the grave with him, because it can always be rediscovered later. It can never, it's this concept that it can never be lost to humanity, since, and this is what Jung was saying, since magic is reborn in each and every one of us. So there's this correlation between magic and alchemy happening too with Jung. And it's this concept that certain disciplines like alchemy are just, this is what I got from it, that they're just extended parts of humanity, like gold as well. It exists alongside of us regardless of what we do. But with gold, it's almost like it's there waiting for us to make a move and to figure out its uses. And that is where, going back to like how this happened, Heidi and I were talking about gold and its uses, and like this weird documentary about Ormus and all these modern alchemists and stuff, right, Heidi? And you had some very interesting stuff that you already knew just from the jump about that.
Well, I mean, as far as the movie goes, I really liked it. I thought that they did a pretty good representation, but I think it's pretty interesting that at the end we still have no answers, right? And I think that's just like how it figures, basically, right? It's going to be kept secret. I think it's interesting. Like, it's only precious. It's not strong. It's not, it's very flexible. It's kind of wimpy material, all these things. And you would think that it wouldn't be as precious as other items, and I kind of went down a weird rabbit hole on the periodic table just because I'm weird. And I looked up the number that gold represented, and it's 79. And I found it really interesting as I was studying down the line. Do you know Pergamon, the throne of Satan, Pergamon? Well, it's exactly 79 feet from Smyrna, and they made a big deal about this. And the Nazis were really into this whole situation so much with Pergamon that they took the throne of Pergamon and they moved it to Germany. And so I just found like this other weird rabbit hole, and I know we'll go into the movie too, but I when I was looking down the periodic table at these kind of things, these little things were popping up, and I thought that's really odd. Like, what's going on here? Because anytime you look at power, right, you're going to hit Nazis. I promise. They figured some stuff out, same with this movie, which we can totally go into, but I'm just like,
But that Pergamon, that's in a museum right now, right? In Switzerland, maybe? Or is it in Germany?
They moved it. I think it's still in Germany. I know they've moved it clear to Germany for Hitler. It was moved specifically for him. And it was kind of fascinating to me that popped up just because I was researching the number. It had nothing to do with gold, but I did find that very interesting when I was looking up with periodic table, which even the numbers added together, end up 7. We end up back at 7. So yeah, it's kind of, I'm always looking at gematria stuff and going, that's fun. But like, of course, I'm always looking at weird stuff, like the occult side of things, because my brain, I don't know. The Mormons warped my brain. I don't know.
Where was this throne originally?
It was in Pergamum by Smyrna. So 79 feet from Smyrna, and they moved it when they wanted to do something grand for Hitler. It was specifically for him. And he said, I want something wonderful. And not only did they move that, at the same time, they moved, I believe, something of Ashtaroth too. I'll have to look at that, but I know for sure.
Isn't it that throne, is it linked to Zeus as well somehow? Like I feel like I've heard some people look at it through the lens of it's, I guess, Lucifer's throne, but it's Zeus as well, right?
Well, okay, Paranoid, pick it up.
I mean, I was just say potato a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of if you reach back far enough, you go, who am I talking about again? Depends.
There's a duality with some of these entities in my research.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me, the Zeus connection too. I mean, a king needs his throne, and I read a fantastic book called The The Lord of the World or The King of the World by Rene Guénon, and he really gets into the symbolism with the number four and these ancient lords who believe that they reign from the center of Earth. And so symbolically, they would want their throne or their temple or their castle to be like in the middle of their village or empire or region. And oftentimes they would basically have a north-south sort of line emanating from the throne and an east-west. So you would quarter the land basically. And so he's getting into all of the symbolism with quartering and the number four and these kings and lords. And what do you know? Christ was crucified on a cross. The glyph for Zeus, basically Jupiter, the glyph for Jupiter looks like the number four. So there's this like all the symbolism that relates to king, lord, throne, empire stuff, reigning from the center and kind of their laws and everything emanating from sort of the sacred center of their land.
When you say reigning, it's just crazy because there's like this fun synchromistic wordplay that goes on because Zeus, I believe the way that he created Perseus was that he was being like locked away, and I can't remember all the names of all the goddesses, but I remember that in order to get to this goddess and impregnate her, Zeus literally turns himself into golden rain. Whenever I heard that, I think I had already seen Terminator 2, so I just imagine Zeus is like T-1000ing, and he can like morph into different sort of materials and like but he literally turns into rain and then uses that to impregnate and create Perseus. So I think that like the golden rain is also like a very literal version of golden rain to show that how like he can just kind of permeate through everything. We were just talking about like the gold nanoparticles. I mean, that's a kind of again, it reminds me of this like concept of Zeus, golden rain, being able to permeate through things.
Wow.
I love how these metals have all these double meanings. And we were talking about goddesses, and something came to mind. In that list of the 7 metals of alchemy, you have gold, silver, but you also have copper. Copper's planetary influence is Venus. Venus is associated with Ashtar, who is a goddess that I've been coming up against a lot in my research. And honestly, I found all this kind of in a weird kind of a backdoor way through Isaac Newton, who was an alchemist. Honestly, when you look into a lot of these guys, especially these guys that were big in the frontier of math and science, when you trace the roots of math and science, they come out of this world of alchemy and of magic and metallurgy. And they said that Newton wrote 1,000,000 words on the subject of alchemy, yet a lot of those writings were destroyed right after he died. They were burned. And they say it was as a way of like preserving his reputation or whatnot. But Newton studied the Emerald Tablet, which is, of course, where we get the phrase "as above, so below." And I think Newton was infatuated with that concept. And he wrote about "as above, so below," adding that all things have their birth from one thing. And he said the sun is the father, the moon is the mother. So this is very much God and goddess talk to me. And that indicates as well that I think he was familiar with the symbology of gold, because I'm back to that number 7 and gold being part of the 7 metals of alchemy. It's this, celestial counterpart is the sun. And I mean, the rest of the list is, if anybody's interested, it's gold represents the sun, silver the moon, copper the Venus, or copper Venus, iron Mars, tin Jupiter, Mercury of course, and lead Saturn. So there's also counterparts. There's God entity counterparts to all these metals as well. So it's like with this subject and with gold, it's like, how deep do you want to go with this? Because it doesn't have a bottom.
Well,
yeah, Freya. Oh, sorry. Freya was considered that too. Lord Brahma, Freya, Chryseis, all those are over gold. All those gods.
When you're saying there's no bottom to this, the thing that fascinates me the most, even beyond all like the historical and like the woo-woo connections that you can make, is that how was it, is it just coincidence that all of the ancients basically put the three most conductive things for electricity at the top of this, and that if we've got the sun and the moon, and all throughout Venus is like the morning star as representing like that Promethean fire, like like because the sun and the moon are out of reach, like that's the god and the goddess, and like they're kind of like the guys that are playing The Sims, but like Venus is sort of like that in between, right? It's like the messenger in a way. And what is like the chances that it's gold, silver, and copper, the three most conductive things, and that all three of these materials have incredibly practical uses in like everyday life. It's not like they accidentally grabbed one particular compound or material that doesn't have a lot of practical uses. They pick like the top three. So that adds this whole extra layer where I'm like, did they just, hit it lucky that we're just like, oh yeah, let's pick these three? Or is there like some of that ancient technology, kind of, I don't know, Tartarian or old world stuff, but there's some of that seems like it's at play. Like somebody knew way back when they were deciding the hierarchy of all these metals, like they knew that these three needed to be in the top. And how the hell did they know that?
Yeah, right. Exactly. No doubt. Yeah. I mean, super strategic for very good reason, definitely. One of the things I want to mention is basically gold symbolism and sun symbolism. They're right there next to each other. They're synonymous essentially in many different ways. And one of the ways they're synonymous as well, according to my research, symbolically, is that the sun really has been used as a metaphor as for something else. It's not always when the sun is being referenced in an older text, when it's even being referenced in like an older like work of art or anything else really for that matter. Sometimes it's actually a metaphor that it's not literally the sun that rises in the east and sets in the west. It's not literally the sun that you can see with your eyes. It's a central sun. It's a spiritual sun. It's a philosopher's sun. There's a lot of the black sun, I think maybe is an interface for this as well, but it's actually more of a central stationary sun. So the way I tend to see things is that the sun that I can go outside and see right now, this is the mobile sun. This is the sun that moves, that rises and sets. But there is another sun, symbolic sun, which is basically the sort of sacred center or the holy of holies of this whole entire place. And so that center has been looked at and has been called the world axis, basically. If people want to look into this, the world axis or the axis mundi, it's the gift that keeps on giving. I tell my symbolic students, it's like, if you want to fast track your symbolic awareness, look into the world axis because it is so important. And so this world axis was believed to be the center of this domain. It has a relationship with the axis of Earth. So the North Pole, and then also by extension to the pole star, the North Star, the star of stars, the guiding star, and all of the fixed stars revolve around this central star, right? And so this is excluding the wandering stars, the planets, right? But all of the other stars revolve around this star. And so the world axis and sort of this symbolic sacred center has been viewed as essentially being immutable. It doesn't change. The North Star, day after day, year after year, it's in the exact same position. You can't say the same about the sun, right? And so gold has basically been used as a metaphor for finding a center, for finding the core of something. And so I think that that's sort of the relationship between gold and sun symbolism, is that the sun has been used as a symbolic metaphor for this sort of center. Gold has been used as a metaphor for that center. While doing research to prepare for this chat, in one of my books, it said something along the lines of, if the heart is the center of man, gold is like the symbolic center of Earth, basically, even though it's spread around all over the Earth, right? So it's a condensation, potentially, or at least what people have said is of light. So even the Hindus, they say that it's mineral light, that's what gold is. And so the sun has basically been used as sort of the emblematic central point in all that is, basically. And so it's a whole entire deep dive. I did a presentation called The Rising Sun, Esoteric Sun Symbolism on my YouTube if people want to hear a little bit more about this, because it is absolutely fascinating. And there's a number of occultists and mystics and sages and things like that that have written about this over the years, of this sort of supernal sun, this principal sun that goes beyond the east. You know, that's one way people have referred to it, that it's beyond the east. When people have, you know, different occultists and things like that have had this quest for the Orient. The Orient is actually like beyond the east. It's beyond any actual physical location on Earth. It's a metaphor for something else. So hopefully that made sense.
Did you find that any correlations between the North Star and that magnetic black rock that's, you know,
Oh
in
yeah.
myth about being at the North Pole?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, even sometimes the North Star is referred to as the lodestar, you know, and then that black rock is sometimes referred to as the lodestone. So yeah, that's a whole entire thing, basically, for sure. You know, I mean, all compasses pointing north, right? Potentially because of this magnetic stone or symbolic stone. People have said many things over the years about what's there, by the way. A
Yeah.
stone, a mountain, a world tree. It might just be the center of a Taurus field sort of thing. So it's like highly charged and magnetized and things like that. And so, yeah, that's like one of my jams is all things northern, pretty much, because I think it's a huge key to a lot of things, in my opinion.
I think you can layer on some more like practical uses of gold on what you were just saying there, Mario, about like gold not just being about light and being like a metaphor for a lot of different things, and that gold is sort of like what makes the earth turn in a way. And you're it's almost like they were describing like a metaphysical version of heliocentrism, right? Like the sun, aka gold, is literally the axis of the world, where everything else kind of revolves around. But it also does, it literally represents light, not just in like metaphysical ways, because and this is one of those weird things. It was like 4 years ago, I think, like 2018. It might a little longer than that. But 2018, there was like these Japanese researchers that they were doing solar cell sort of research, and actually found out that they could trap way more light in between layers of gold in particular. And the same reason that they use gold in solar panels, it makes it more efficient because gold naturally absorbs more light than many other conductive materials do. So again, it's one
Mm.
of those weird mind things where it's like, how the hell did they know? Like, why did they coincidentally just pick this one material that happens to have all of these uses that some we didn't even realize until like the last decade, and we're still figuring out. Oh my God, gold somehow is able to harness like literal sunlight. And I mean, I'm oversimplifying that, but it has a very real practical use that goes beyond just like melting down and being malleable.
Yeah, it can
Oh yeah,
be
exactly.
beneficial in your health as well. Without a little bit of gold in your body, then the neurons in your brain actually can't charge. There has to be a little bit of
Mm.
gold in your body with copper. And then also, if you wear it, they say it decreases your risks of stroke and cardiac problems as well. So,
Mm.
kind of interesting for body wise.
I'm really into herbs and herbal remedy. And this whole time, just while studying this, I couldn't help but think that gold might have a medicinal property. I know, Mario, I think you mentioned ancient India, and I know they have those Ayurvedic medicines there, or I think it's an actual, just a whole study called Ayurvedic.
Yeah,
And
it's a whole system. Yeah.
it's a whole system. They ingest gold for healing purposes in that culture as well. And then the ancient Chinese used it in many different ways, but specifically healing ointments. It's been used as amulets on necklaces to like ward off evil,
Mm.
almost like a talisman, getting back to maybe magical purposes here. And then, you know, you I don't care if we talk about this documentary or not today, but you do have this documentary where these are modern people talking about Ormus, and they're basically touting this as a health supplement that can improve brain function, almost like a, I don't know, like a lion's mane mushroom or something. It's very interesting.
Right. Interesting. Lion, Leo, ruled by the sun. There's only one sign ruled by the sun, and it's Leo. I think this is actually very interesting timing that we're talking about gold right now. We're in Cancer season, the beginning of summer. Leo is ruled by the sun. So astrologically, gold corresponds with the lion, with Leo, and then I would say the tarot card too that corresponds with it would be like the sun card. You could maybe make the argument too that the strength card relates to it. But yeah, gold kind of warding off evil or whatever. The lion has kind of been viewed the same way. The lion is really fascinating too as a creature. It relates very strongly to serpent symbolism. And there's a lot of myths about serpents and dragons protecting gold or protecting treasure. That's kind of their whole entire thing, is like protecting like a sacred center sort of thing, right? So like protecting a castle and the princesses in the castle or whatever it is. And so there's a lot of overlap, with all of this. But, if you were to use a metal or symbolically have something on your side to ward off evil, I mean, I think gold totally makes a lot of sense. As it relates to health, I just have to say, putting myself out there a little bit because it's kind of a taboo topic with a lot of people. Urine being golden, it's like golden waters. And I've been looking into and I've been practicing urine therapy for a little while now. And I have to say, it's a fascinating study for so many different reasons. It's absolutely insane. But as I was preparing for this chat, I'm like, man, urine being gold. This is also an Ayurvedic thing too. Shiva actually promoted drinking your own urine, but he said it's supposed to be a secret. And so there's this secrecy that is kind of associated with it, that it's not necessarily supposed to be out in the open, and all these other types of things. But people have so many amazing stories about urine therapy and kind of like what it does for you. I personally think, after looking into it for however long I've been looking into it, I think that we're meant to do it, actually. I think that our system is designed to actually ingest your own urine. But it's not for the faint of heart, that's for sure. And I'm not claiming that everyone should go out and start drinking their own pee or whatever. But the fact that it's golden, to me, kind of interesting.
That reminds me of Bear Grylls drinking his old pee.
He's actually enlightened
Man
now.
versus Wild.
Yeah.
He's like an ascended master now because of all the pee that he's. And I
man.
guess to wrap this back around into pee and lions and fecal matter, I guess, once again. But one of my favorite sort of like out there, I think I got this one from Slick Dissident, Gabe. Shout out Gabe. But he was telling the story about how, just like Mario was saying, you would use lions to protect your castle, to protect your princess, your treasure. And one of the variations of this is that it wasn't necessarily the lion, even though a lion will definitely mess you up. You can probably use the protect stuff, but that the lions and these large cats would also tend to pass on toxoplasmosis through their fecal matter, whatever. And that this in itself was even more of a barrier, because now not only did you have to prove yourself by getting by the lions physically, but you'd also have to get through and not go mad from the toxoplasmosis. And if you could get through that, then it means that you actually had like a desirable genetic trait that was somewhat resistant to toxoplasmosis, so that anyone else that would come through would either lose their mind or they would get mauled. So it was like this one extra little check. And that toxoplasmosis also was kind of like this link to like a whole extra dimension of consciousness. And I guess if you wanted to like strain that into gold, meaning some sort of like ultra enlightenment or like a greater conscious state. I mean, toxoplasmosis and LSD trips. I've never done straight up toxoplasmosis by like sniffing a cat's butt or whatever. But I mean, if there's any correlation between the typical psychedelic experience, that could easily be construed into being like golden.
Well, they just say that I'll steal the thunder on this one because I am a Leo the lion. My birthday is coming right
Nice.
up. So I'll steal that one. But I will say this, if you want to do any studies on toxoplasmosis, Brazil is actually the country you want to look at, because they have the highest rate of toxoplasmosis, which actually they have the highest rate of automobile accidents and motorcycle accidents and things like that, because they have no fear. It basically gives them the power to be like, I don't give a shit extra. And they just go crazy that way. Like, it's not crazy. It's just like no inhibition crazy. It makes them more likely to be inhibited. So
This could be a new party drug.
right.
It'd be like right next
Bring
to the
your
poppers.
cat. Bring your
you
cat.
break a little capsule
butt.
open, you sniff it,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden he's like
You've got the glasses on for it, man. You can be the guinea
go.
pig.
There you
Right.
go.
Yeah,
think-
that's interesting. Oh,
I
go ahead,
think.
Tim.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, There's something that we touched on that I can't let go. I just want to bring it back up, and that's that these metals kind of being top conductors. These seven metals of alchemy, and then the top three, the big ones. There are these conductors, and then tying that in with ancient technology. That does something for me. That just like gets me out of bed in the morning, and it takes me back to the pyramids and that version of ancient technology that I know and love. And like, there's a theory that the pyramids were chemical plants, and that certain pyramids produce certain things. And one of the theories is that you have one pyramid that's producing nitric acid, and then you have another pyramid that's producing hydrochloric acid. And when you combine those acids, it creates a substance that will dissolve gold. And I'm gonna do my best slick dissonant on you guys here, because you take that word alchemy, alchemy, right? And if you break that word down, you've got Al or El. The god El was the head of the Canaanite pantheon. El can also be Elohim. And then you have scholars that link El to Yahweh as well. So Chem is the ancient name for Egypt, spelled Khem. It was a region once known as Chem. So the word alchemy for me points back to Egypt and chemistry and divine source. And I think it's very possible that Egypt was a hub for industrial chemistry, not to mention they were all about the gold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, chem or chemet actually, I believe it's a reference to the color black. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's like the black land or something like that.
Yes, it does. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if that correlates to the black sun.
Right. It made me think of that for sure. And then you guys were talking about the blackening earlier, that process, that step. So it could be something with that. Makes me think of other things too. Yeah.
There was I don't know if this was just a rumor. I've read it in some like legit magazine articles, and it wasn't just on like an InfoWars sort of rant, but that in 2001, Freemasons wanted to actually put a golden capstone on the Great Pyramid, and it fell through at like the last minute just because I guess like the Egyptian government just decided not to let foreigners come in and like spearhead this big thing. But man, like how not just the symbolism behind that, but I wonder what the physical after effects would have been by putting an actual golden capstone back onto the pyramid. And on that same note too, we're talking about all like the health benefits that gold has. Like maybe there's something to the Pope sitting in a big gold chair, or like Trump, going into his Trump Tower penthouse to just like golden everything around you. Like what if there really is a reason to do it beyond just being, flamboyant?
No, yeah, I could totally see that. That wouldn't surprise me at all. Even when you're around precious metals and holding precious metals and stuff like that, there's a real resonance to them. In my opinion, I have a gold coin right here. Sorry, a silver coin. I wish it were gold. But just when I look at it and I hold it and things like that, there's actually like a more of a tangible sort of thing there than you might recognize. Initially, it's not just like any other sort of object or what
you
have
catch
you. So I
yourself
can
like
imagine gold.
my precious.
That's what I thought of that too. Yeah, exactly. For sure. The conductive thing. Oh, go ahead, Heidi.
Oh, I was just thinking of the conduction and the bells and how people used to be healed. And when you're talking about conduction, if that had anything to do with it, like maybe there was, some particular area that helped resonate that more, not just with the metal of the bells, but like with the gold on the top of buildings, that we used to see all the time that you were mentioning. So that just struck me as odd for a second.
And they used to put gold flake on top of buildings for the longest time. Like if you go around like Boston, for example, I think like the State House or like a lot of the original buildings used to have gold flake up there, although it got a little pricey, and apparently it's like really heavy too when you put enough on there to like stay on there. But it was, again, maybe there was a practical reason for it, And I'm not even convinced that people know what that practical reason is, the same way that maybe there was an ancient astronaut or like a time traveler that came down and he had like 20 minutes to convey all the information he could to mankind before they went into like some big reset. And all they got out of it was like gold's really important, silver's really important. Like they kind of got like the highlights, and then it was like it got construed into sun god and all this. But maybe we're just working our way back around into these practical uses again.
Yeah.
I did
Right.
want to say my husband works at one of the largest open pit mines in the world, which is Kennecott or Rio Tinto now, and they actually mine copper and precious metals, but they have they are the sole proprietor that digs up the gold at all of the Tiffany's. I thought that was kind of fun. I figured
Mm.
I'd throw that in, shout out my husband.
I think the
That is interesting.
practical purposes, I definitely think there's something to that, you know, especially when we were talking about ingesting gold. And I'll take it back to Egypt for a second. It was in Egypt where Moses was in Pharaoh's palace, and he was around the Egyptian mystery schools. He was being taught, I believe, this arcane knowledge. And later on, and this is that story I alluded to earlier that I had the guest on, he brought this up. When the Israelites made that golden calf, the story goes that Moses broke it down and made them ingest it. And this is where we come to this idea that monatomic gold is rumored to make you smarter. And the thought here is that maybe Moses was saying, hey, you guys are dumb for worshiping a cow. I'm going to use this gold to alchemically enlighten you, to bring you to a higher level of spiritual gnosis. And what's fascinating about this golden calf is that I think for modern people, we have a disconnect with that. We can't imagine why somebody would even consider worshiping something like that. But it's all through these ancient texts, and like there's even this crazy story I came across recently with Jeroboam. He was another guy later on in the Bible. He made golden calves. And he made them either for or associated with goat demons. And the goat demon is like this weird cryptid that I found that's mentioned in the Bible. It's like it's associated with Azazel, but I mean, this guy, Jeroboam, was taking these golden calves that has something to do with goat demons, and he was taking them into battle with him. And it's almost like that golden calf for them served as like a super talisman for summoning the goat demons, and maybe even did something for them in battle. And there's a lot of just really weird stuff like that. Like even God tells the Israelites not to prostitute themselves to goat demons, and it's like, why is sex involved in this too now, and what's this association with gold?
The goat demon reminds me of the one like Pan. What's the name of it?
Pan is definitely one of the goats.
Yeah, but
like the
the other
satyrs.
name,
Are you thinking of like
the
Baphomet?
other name for Pan, not
Saturn.
Baphomet. He was the drunk one. Dionysus. Dionysus.
Well, he
is that
could,
right?
yeah. Dionysus could turn himself into a goat, I believe.
Yeah, that one as well. So it makes you think about like these different things. Like, okay, maybe that has something to do with it because they did make a whole lot of statues of that. And speaking of the Bible, I thought it was weird when I looked up 79, which is the periodic table on gold. Also, the two things that struck me, now there's 16 different meanings, but one of them was deliverance of Yah. But the second one that I found even more interesting was the king of Bashan. And if you know that story, we're talking about aliens here. We're talking about the Nephilim. I think the king of Bashan was a giant. I mean, they have his metric measurements for the bed and everything, which I thought was weird. Og of Bashan. Yep. So kind of funny.
As the goat relates to gold, there's a couple of things that actually comes to mind. One would be that, goat symbolism parallels in many different ways symbolism related to Saturn, right? So like Capricorn, the sea goat, is ruled by Saturn, as an example. Saturn corresponding with lead, we're talking about transmuting potentially lead into gold. And then also too, there's a whole entire thing with goat symbolism too, and that I've gotten into over the years, but like actually like wheat, and wheat kind of being a very solar symbol as well. So sometimes you'll see Pan actually playing like his flute in like a big old wheat field, and it's all golden and everything else, because he's like a pastoral deity basically. And so I don't know, I just see kind of a couple different parallels there. But the main thing I was going to say, though, is that the golden age, when you look into this last supposed golden age, what a number of authors have said is that it was actually ruled by Saturn. And so in today's world, most people think of Saturn, just like right now I said lead. Most people might think of like Father Time and things like that with his scythe and with, an hourglass or whatever. I actually personally think that there was sort of a transition with Saturnian symbolism, that it was actually viewed as being more positive, and that it was probably more feminine as well, and that there was sort of a flip or transition that kind of happened over time. And so I actually did a couple of presentations on this called The Lost Lore of Saturn. So most people, when they think of Saturn, they don't think of a golden age, but a number of people have said that that actually was the ruling planet of the last golden age. And speaking to that as well, as it relates to gold and the sun and everything else, what I've also read that I think is really fascinating, it makes a lot of sense to me personally, is that one of the major things that was lost during transitions out of the golden age, and why we have kind of fallen, if you were to believe that narrative, is that the center itself was no longer something that people actually had any sort of reverence for. And so literally the center of self, the center of their people, the center comes to me, everything emanates from a center and returns to the center. It's just like a torus field. And so not being concerned about the center, not having a reverence for the center, it's by going to your center. That's how you tap into the cosmos, in my opinion. Know thyself and you'll know the universe, And so going to your center, I mean, so many different like mystics and things like that have talked about that sort of still point within, relating to your heart, actually. And so when you're off center and your people have been off center and ungrounded and all these other types of things, and you've lost that philosophy, you've lost that reverence, I could see why you would kind of like fall into sort of a darker age, right? And so that's my understanding, is during the last golden age, people were more centered, kind of long story short, basically.
I've got another.
Thomas would say they were off their square.
Don't make me put the hat on.
I'm sorry.
I've got another goat connection here too, though, because like the goat and the Capricorn, such a great sort of reference there. That's a perfect one, because also people with Capricorn qualities, like capricious qualities, are known for their stubbornness and their perseverance, and those traits are also what made the goat sort of symbolic of alchemists. Usually, like an alchemist would have like a goat as like a little sidekick, and that really was this symbolism to say like, hey, even when they're going, against the grain, and even when you keep doing the same experiment over and over and it's not doing anything, the alchemists, they will persevere, and that's one of the traits that is really needed to be able to transmute base metals into gold, especially if you're talking about like the metaphorical, like spiritual kind. Like you have to have that hard-headed perseverance that's like usually associated with goats.
I thought that was to grow their homunculus so that they could bring them back to life if anything happened. That's why I think
cows are the more important. Cows and dogs, ironically.
That's true. Not all of the dog, just a part of the dog. But we won't give away everything, right? The biggest dog thing. You know what I'm talking about. You and Juan. You and your
elaborate.
The giant dog dicks that you
there it is.
But I do think that it's funny that as you were going through all of the different things, and each one, like Jupiter was tin, I was thinking maybe Joseph Smith was really an alchemist, and he was thinking he was turning his tin into gold for the golden plates, because I think they were tin underneath that cloth. But yeah.
Interesting.
Nah, for real. I think he really did make a set of those. But anyway,
I love the concept of the center. Mario, as well. That's something I hadn't considered. And, you know, I think about God and spirituality in a similar way, where I think that sometimes what God does is he kind of like holds up a mirror and he says, look
Mhm.
deeper within. Because I
Yeah.
think the answers that we seek are deeper within. I think our connection to the cosmos is within. And I'm not saying that to get religious at all, but I do think that there's a spiritual component to this. And I think, I mean, I don't know if anybody came across this, but the Egyptians had this stuff called MITS, MFTKTZ. It's weird spelling, Mifkits, I think. And they they had it's basically monatomic gold. It's a form of gold that they use. And in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, they refer to an actual field of Mifkets. And it's like this extra dimensional realm. And it was thought of as a superconductive energy field that sort of somehow reacts with the Mifkets, with the gold. And it had something to do with the Pharaoh's journey into the afterlife.
Mm.
And it was also for the Egyptians, it was associated with the pyramids. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were putting that on their pyramids, maybe at the top, uh, or maybe even just coating them in gold. I'm not sure, but I think that they knew how to use it for some kind of way like that. They also there was a lot of Jewish people in Egypt, and so you have this tie-in with the Ark of the Covenant, which of course held the tablets that were revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. So we're back to Moses and that event where he has them ingest the gold. And so I look at it like that. I see it in the Bible, but I also see it in like uh, the Vedic texts as well, and other spiritual books, specifically dealing with strange technologies. And I mean, just to tie it in, I guess spiritually, like I did find this verse in the Bible. It's a very alchemical verse. It's Job 28, 5 through 9. It says, as for the earth, out of it cometh bread, and under it is turned up as if it were fire. The stones of it are the place of sapphires, and it hath the dust of gold.
Mm.
Well,
And
they used to put gold coins on people's eyes when they died too, to help them cross, right? Wasn't that
Well,
part of
also
the
if you
river?
look into like more practical uses of gold, one of the other big ones is blocking radiation. And you only need like a few millimeters of
Ooh.
thickness of gold in order to block like alpha and beta radiation. But if you had an actual sarcophagus, like an actual tomb made out of gold, like that can damn near block X-rays if it's thick enough. So there's again this weird thing like I almost wonder if the Egyptians got like half the message. Like maybe like did they have ancient technology or were they trying to like piece back together like clues that were left them? So they're like, okay, we know we have to create these vessels made out of thick gold and put our important people in them to protect them on a passage somewhere. But I don't know, maybe that was like them shooting in outer space, or like maybe there's like some other process that like they replace it with death because death was the more obvious version. I feel the same way too. Another version of gold could be construed as the Amanita muscaria cap because as it you leave it out in the sun and it dries up, it goes from a red color to like a golden color. And it's also been described as like the holy grail, like this golden chalice to turn. But without getting to that entire tangent, but it's sort of the same exact premise where you've got like a thing that becomes construed as gold, but then over time it's like only the highest priests knew about using this mushroom in order to commune with God. And over time, they buried the secret, they buried the lead so well that at a certain point they were like, oh, maybe we can just use these crackers. Maybe the crackers are the same thing. And there wasn't anyone around to be like, no, no, no. Like it's like, no, the cracker isn't it. Like you have to have the golden cap in order for this to make sense. And I wonder if it's a similar thing with like the ancient Egyptians and all the use of gold in these places. Like they know part of it. They just don't know why they're doing it, and therefore they don't do the whole thing.
Exactly. Dude, I love all of what you just said. That's a really awesome weave. There's so much to talk about with all of this stuff. But yeah, bread once again, coming from wheat or grains, you know, and then having that golden color. By the way, I forgot to say that pan, you know, in Spanish, it's pan means bread, right? And pan also means all, like panspermia. So there's an interesting sort of connection with all of that stuff still that's
And
kind
you
of like
pan for
unfolding.
gold. That's like the most
Pan for
popular
gold. There you go,
version,
man.
right?
Hell yeah, that's awesome.
Well,
Yeah, yeah, totally.
and when Tim and me got lost in these weeds at the beginning of our whole chat was because I was talking about gold juice. And I said, as a nurse, one day when this girl, what was the girl that was on the TV show Orange is the New Black? She was the one talking about it. And she was talking about gold juice, right? And I had just got done with my
Oh, right.
interview with Zachary King. He's an ex satanic high wizard. And he was talking to me about all this. And I said, as soon as they started talking, he had seen somebody basically getting a transfusion of something. He was waiting for a while for them to get done. And he said, when they came out, this was like in the early 80s, like before any of this business came out. He said the guy was way younger. Like he looked really decrepit. And then he came out and he was like 20 years younger. And he was like, I'm serious. It's a thing. And I said, you know what it is? It's blood. It's platelets. Because when you spin down blood, you can see it rise to the top and it's gold. And I've given it enough times. It's the one fluid that we can put back and basically, and I have, grab it, squeeze it as high like as you can to get that back in. Like you can't do that with whole blood. You can't do that with anything else. You've got to be really careful. But you can do that with platelets. And that's what we were talking about, which kind of got us lost. But I said it's gold. They're totally talking about blood. I mean, I think. But
Oh yeah, no, well, the urine thing, just real quick, it's
yeah,
golden, and your kidneys, right? And so if my understanding is correct, urine is essentially filtered, diluted blood plasma.
Yep.
So there's an interesting relationship with blood and urine.
And you were talking about, I think her name's Taryn Manning, the one that was from Orange is the New Black. She played this character, Tiffany Doggett, which was like the meth mouth chick.
Yeah, the meth mouth girl.
But I just have to point out there that the gold juice, which has like been turned into a meme, but I haven't heard anyone else bring this up. But I went deep into adrenaline and derivative research. I won't go on that whole tangent. But
I liked your video.
Well, yeah, it's in my video, but aside from like the big bad word that you can't even say on most platforms that you derive from adrenaline, but it has yet another compound that's related to called adrenolutin. And adrenolutin, instead of having a red or a dark red or a black color, adrenolutin has been described as a greeny/gold substance. Like it actually had a green gold look to it. And the reason that they never really pursued it as much as its related compounds was because the original guys that were doing research, they took a little bit of adrenolutin and they said the effects lasted for more than 2 weeks, which basically makes it untenable for something that you can actually do like scientific experiments with, because it's 2 weeks long. Like you can't find the sample size, right?
Right. And if you look at that, like we get back into the weeds, headed back to the Nazis with adrenaline stuff. Like I'm telling you, like it anything that gives you power like that, and you guys should check out his show on that. Where's it at? It's on Rumble, isn't it?
Right now, it's on Rumble and it's on Twitter is the only place. It's got like 360,000 views on Twitter. And everywhere else, it gets like smacked out of existence.
It's really good. As a nurse, I was like, this was a really good job. And I told him that. I thought it was done really well and researched well. And he's not talking nonsense. Like it's all legit. But I mean, there's got to be something to all this, right? When you're talking about chemical substances, body substances, you know, all these different things that are critical. This is all critical stuff. And you know, they know. We don't know, but somebody knows. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I don't know how this works. Like I don't know the science behind it, but apparently they also use gold as a lubricant in space, if you believe space exists. But that in order to prevent the items from like rubbing up against each other in this like zero gravity space, they put like small amounts of gold inside of there.
I was told that they were using that in the panels as well for some of the I don't know, some of the spacecraft, if you know, that NASA was using gold as an ingredient for some function to put in on the sides of rockets that go into
Well, it
space.
has a bunch of different uses. One of them is that it blocks UV from the sun a lot better than other materials. And then again, just like the straight up radiation blockage, which also prevents like all kinds of other deterioration from happening. It's like a magical sunscreen for space.
We got to call Andreas. Ask him.
Actually, I wanted to
"Mm."
elaborate on this because I love the fact that you brought up this shielding sort of dynamic with gold, because it really comes into play with actually the sun card in the tarot. And so you usually see a wall in the sun card. I don't know if you guys have ever noticed or how much you guys study tarot, but generally you see a wall in the background. It's not uncommon to have two children holding hands, or two children, or a man and a woman in front of this wall. This wall is interesting because there is that protective dynamic that you're referring to. I also think of like the glyph of the sun itself, which is the circumpunct, the circle with a dot. I've heard some people make the claim that the outer circle is kind of like that shield. Same idea with that wall, you know, in the tarot card. And then also with that same glyph, right, for the sun, you have that sacred center, you have that middle, right? So it's a very, very important symbol. The dot is an important symbol. The dot correlates with center symbolism as well. And also within the tarot card too, it's not uncommon to see sunflowers. So the sunflowers, a lot of times, like in the Rider-Waite, which is a classic tarot deck, are right behind that wall. And sunflowers, because of what they do, and their flowers are so huge, they've been referred to as shield flowers. Basically, we have them in our front yard, and they kind of create like this barrier sort of thing. So there's shield symbolism just with the sunflower, and then also with this card itself. So everything you're kind of saying or said about this shielding dynamic with gold just reminded me of that.
I like the sunflower reference. When you look at a sunflower, my neighbor has one right now, and it's huge. It just towers over every other plant like it. And when you look at some of the old alchemical illustrations, the sun in those old illustrations look almost like a sunflower. Just the way they draw it. Of course, they put a face on it and everything like that. So for me, that might be another herbal tie-in. And I think it's great that we're having this conversation right now when we are, and that alchemy is so ingrained in this discussion. And I think this topics like this, they kind of come up, they kind of rear their head when the time is right. You know, I look at Carl Jung. He discovered alchemy in his 50s, and they said he devoted the remaining 30 years of his life to it. And my point is this, he's credited with reviving it from its abandoned grave. And I just think maybe the time is right. And, you know, everybody was saying about that Terrence Howard interview on Rogan that it was like a math conversation, but I personally kind of heard like an alchemical conversation there. And, you know, I only mention it because that show is such a giant billboard for indicating people's readiness to discuss certain topics. So I'm thinking that alchemy might be on a horizon for another comeback. And he was saying some stuff that I didn't agree with, but he said some stuff that I liked. He was talking about how carbon unwinds and becomes nitrogen, and nitrogen unwinds and becomes oxygen, because carbon and the elements have this potential metamorphosis. And I think he was saying that everything can change and transmute. And it reminded me of Pythagoras and the philosophy of the four changes, which is that everything is in a constant state of going from metal to mineral to vegetable to or through animal and back. And yeah, there was a lot of stuff. I mean, he talked about the Emerald Tablet. That, of course, that's an origin story for alchemy. That's Crowley's tarot deck to kind of tie that in. And I'll mention another thing he said, just to maybe take this back to ancient technology again. He was talking about how Terrence Howard was talking about how the Sumerians, in his opinion, gave humanity our system of math. And that's why we use 1 × 1 = 1. he's saying that humanity was deceived by the Anunnaki and that they gave us a limited equation. And Terence thinks that if you just observe the universe, you'll come to the conclusion that 1 times 1 should actually be 2. And just to tie it in with what we're talking about today, one version of that story about the Anunnaki goes like this, right? They came here, they deceived, they enslaved because they needed gold. They needed to apparently suspend gold particles in their atmosphere as like a cure for a dying planet or a dying atmosphere. But ultimately, I think he's saying that, mathematical truths have been hidden from us. And I would just say, to add to that, similarly, I think alchemy has been branded as pseudoscience, and maybe there's parts of this that have been hidden from us. And, they say that alchemy gave way to chemistry, and alchemy did turn into chemistry, but you got to think, like Terence McKenna said, chemistry is the material side of alchemy, stripped of its spirituality and its depth and its connection to God.
Well, you mentioned Isaac Newton when we first started talking about this, and Isaac Newton, not to compare Isaac Newton and Terrence Howard, maybe a little bit, but if you look into Isaac Newton's track record, right, he's sort of like Nostradamus in a way, where everyone latches on to all the things that he got right, but if you look at just a game of numbers, I think that Nostradamus and Isaac Newton got like 80% of the things that they wrote down wrong, or at least according to conventional knowledge now. And it was just a few of the things that really hit on it. And actually, alchemy was one of those things that scholars are like, what an idiot, you know what I mean? Like, okay, you kind of understood gravity in a way, or you described it in a way that we still use, but all this other stuff is nonsense. So I feel like the people that are overly critical of Terrence Howard in particular, it's not like any actual chemist or alchemist at any point in history had like a 1,000 batting average, right? Some of them had like 100 batting average, but you only have to hit like a few home runs to kind of get into the history books. So I think that there's that one aspect of it. And then also we're talking about like alchemy. It would be remiss not to mention Paracelsus, who's kind of like the granddaddy of a lot of this alchemy, and he really believed in something called aurification, which was a way of working with gold. But he actually also said that gold would solve all sorts of ailments with people.
Right, right. You know what's so fascinating as we keep on talking about all this stuff, and as I kind of made my claim, I guess, about gold relating to the center, I think that's the answer for a lot of people and their actual sort of emotional or mental sort of issues, and also physical issues and ailments as well. It really is like going to the center of things, It's even like symbolically kind of like how many people, I know at least a lot of people, where like they have a medical issue and they're trying to find the heart of the medical issue. They're like, is it diet related? Is it environmental? Is it actually psychological or spiritual or whatever? And so I think looking for gold is symbolic of looking for the center, which connects you with all centers. This is sort of my interpretation of what I've been reading and everything else, is that literally in my cosmology, I don't think we personally live on like a spinning ball or whatever. I think that we all have a universal up and down, that we all share the same up and down no matter where you're at in the world. This has been a complete mindfuck, I think, that has kind of been thrust upon us, that everyone around the world has a different sort of up and down based on where they're located on this sphere. But in the ancient world, my understanding is everyone had a universal up and also a universal down. This is why as above, so below is so powerful, because what you're really talking about is you're talking about the hierarchy of reality. And so there's a spiritual hierarchy. There's a real hierarchy. There are planes above and planes below. Perhaps we're on the lowest plane. I don't know. But when you take all this into account, and that there's actually real spheres or realities above and below, how you actually are able to interact or communicate or perhaps astral travel there is through the center, because the center is actually the axis between realms above and below, basically. And so it's the true bridge between the above and the below. So this search for treasure, for gold, I think a lot of relics, actually. This is my personal take. Like whether you're talking about the Holy Grail, I don't know, the Spear of Destiny, things like the Philosopher's Stone, I kind of feel the same way about, to be honest. You're actually searching for the center that connects all of the realms above and below. As you access your center, that's how you're able to kind of penetrate these different layers of existence. Once again, going to your center, that's how you commune with the cosmos, basically. And so that's my interpretation. There's sort of a golden thread, or there's a golden chain, or a symbolic ladder, Jacob's ladder, or a pillar that connects everything above and below, and you find it through that center. So I think a lot of myths and symbols and stuff are actually about this sacred center.
Tim, to your point too, mathematics is the language of God and how he wrote the universe. That's Galileo for you on the mathematics part. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
I hope I'm not off on this, but you mentioned the Spear of Destiny, or the Lance of Longinus, right? And I think that the important, just like saying like that also represents center in a way, that the Spear of Destiny pierces Jesus, and I believe it hits his liver. I'm pretty sure that's where like it actually hits and pierces in his side. And that again, in alchemy, the liver was the organ that was associated with gold, not just because it represented life, hence the word live Uri, but that the color itself, when they were analyzing it, it was like a brownish goldish color to them. So just another version of like how all of these myths kind of like point back towards gold. Yeah, sorry, Tim, go ahead.
That's great.
Oh, I was just going to say, Heidi said something earlier about everything going back to the Nazis, which I agree with. And what I heard in what Mario just like dropped for us there, which is great, man. Like everything you said was like resonating with me. But
Awesome.
You mentioned all those relics, and if I'm not mistaken, most of the relics you mentioned, the Nazis were after.
Yep.
and I love it. I love thinking about it. Like they were after these relics, but they were also after technology, forbidden, forgotten technology associated with these relics. And to go back to what you're saying, like, were they trying to bridge this divide?
I think they definitely did bridge some, because they were heads and tails above everybody else in technology. And if you look at that, I think there was some reasons behind it. I really do. And Thomas, you were right. It did hit the liver.
I'm glad I didn't.
That's a great
expose
insight.
myself on that one.
Yeah, I mean, Nazi symbolism is fascinating. It's been something that I've studied for a long time now, but I'll just say this, my personal opinion, the swastika goes back to the northern sky. It's the Big Dipper going around the pole star, and the fixed stars circumambulate counterclockwise around the pole star. The Big Dipper kind of looks like a number 7, so if you look at it once per season, you're going to see each arm of the swastika. A number of people have written about this all over the world. This is an Eastern idea too. You'll find it in Eastern texts, that the Big Dipper essentially is the swastika. That's where we get the swastika shape from. This relates to black sun symbolism and all sorts of other things. If you read newer books on symbolism, most people are going to say that the swastika relates to the sun, and that it's like a sun wheel or a solar sort of spinning kind of thing. I see it as the spin of the cosmos. So really, it's the spin around this central axis that I was sort of referring to earlier. And all of their symbolism relates to polar, northern, center symbolism, basically. So we're dealing with the allies versus the axis, right? The axis of evil. And then also, I think it's fascinating that they invaded Poland, because the pole is another reference to this central axis. There's a number of religions and cults and things like that that have made use of a central pole or a central totem of some kind, and then you circumambulate around it. It's not like a maypole or something like that. In voodoo, it's called the potomaton. They basically literally say that this central pole, this central pillar, literally connects the above and the below, just like what I'm referring to. It's actually literally that bridge symbolically to them, between all that is above and all that is below. So a lot of ancient cultures had a central totem that they would actually spin around. The swastika basically is just another symbol of that. Personally, that's how I tend to see it.
The golden
we could do a whole
ratio is
Nazi episode if you
actually-
guys want to.
Yeah,
because
the
it seems
golden
like you guys are
ratio
interested in it.
Yeah, actually built into the swastika. So you're right on that.
Nice,
Yeah,
nice.
that's an untapped still. Like, I mean, even with all the World War II documentaries that are out there and all the books and just this pile of like dusty old World War II stuff, it's still when you look at World War II esoterically, specifically the Nazis, it's untapped. There's a whole story there that we're not being told about. And I would like to do a show on that actually. So I don't want to spoil it, but that Vienna and other parts of Germany in the early 1900s were a hub for occultists and all different types. There were all different orders there. It was an amalgamation of occultists, and it was Europe's hub for the esoteric. And they got together and they created a couple of these guys created what was called the Thule Society. And Mario, they were really, and you probably know this, they were really into Northern symbology and all of that. But that group turned into the German Workers' Party, which turned into the Nazi Party. So the Nazis come from this group that's into symbolism, and they were very into that black sun. I mean, I've seen old alchemical illustrations showing the black sun, and I'd like to know more about the real origins of that. But I do know this: Himmler had taken that symbol. Not Hitler, Himmler, right? I just make sure I said that right. But he had a castle in Germany. You could still go online and Google it. You can see where he put the image of the black sun on the walls and on the marble floors of this castle. And the plan was he wanted to make that the new center of the SS, kind of isolated, kind of get everybody together and do these. They wanted to do, what did they call it? Rituals of some sort. I'm not sure what they were planning on doing there, but it was like a Bohemian Grove for Nazis is what he was essentially setting up out there. But he was centering it around this black sun. So they took, in my opinion, they took these symbols, they picked and grabbed these symbols from all over the ancient world, and they rebranded them with their own bastardized ideology, in my opinion. And like I could keep going, but it's just such a fascinating subject.
It really is. And I'll just say this, that part of my study with symbolism, this is what I tend to kind of think is what has happened, is that we've gone through a major symbolic shift over the ages. And basically it went from polar symbolism, so northern symbolism. Some authors have referred to this as the primordial tradition or the northern tradition. I also think it interfaces with what some people have referred to as the stellar tradition, as in the fixed stars. I think it overlays as well with the Typhonian tradition and different sort of magical traditions that people talk about with the Dark Mother and things like this. But things used to be more polar in nature. And Ursa Major and Minor, the northern sky, this was the original sky clock from what I've looked into. And so things shifted though from a polar northern sort of reverence to a solar reverence. So there was a huge shift from polar to solar. And so I read this article by this guy in the 1800s, and it was called Polar and Solar Worship, and it completely blew my mind. And ever since then, I've just been following this thread for many more years, and I'm like, he was spot on. His name was John O'Neill. He had a book called The Night of the Gods. He actually had 2 volumes of it, and he talks about this, and he talks about there being deities in the ancient world that had more of a polar correspondence that later on got shifted to being more solar in nature. And so there's a lot to be said about this. Even like the circumpunct, I said it's the symbol for the sun. I think it's more originally a primordial northern symbol, actually. And I think that that dot represents, the point of pivot for everything. It's that world axis, basically. And so polar to solar, there's a whole entire deep dive rabbit hole here with everything.
There's
So I think the
another
Nazis were kind of, embracing the polar side of things. But go ahead, Thomas.
just more practical versions of all this, like even the swastika that the Nazis basically adopted, which is wild concept in its own right, that like they own this symbol now forever, or at least for a long ass time, right? But they recently have been doing other like nanoparticle studies, and there's a specific nanoparticle structure called a Gamadian gold nanoparticle, and they can synthesize these making actual little swastikas out of gold nanoparticles, and it turns into like this little kind of like a windmill, I guess, to oversimplify it.
Yeah.
And those little windmills, they can actually generate and help synthesize other gold nanoparticles. So again, like what is the coincidence, and like what's the chances that the one symbol that the Nazis ended up adopting actually has a very real practical use in generating either gold nanoparticles and or radiation, therefore energy in a way. Like they could have picked anything, but they picked this one that has a very practical use.
Right, right.
I
Yeah, that's
saw that
fascinating.
swastika a lot in when we're talking about ancient India.
Hmm.
I think they were also I know the Norse were using the swastika, but I think the ancient Indians were also using it for
Well,
purposes.
the Greeks too. If you
Okay.
look at that, like that rectangular pattern that goes around a lot of their designs, the crux of that, the literal crux of that is a Gamade cross, which is the swastika just with extra steps, basically.
Right, right. Yeah, it's fascinating. When I went to India, literally there was one small village in particular where all of the little like rickshaw taxi cars, not all of them, but a lot of them had a red swastika on it with Aryan right next to it. And I was like, what the hell is going on here? I'm like, this is really, really fascinating. But now I think I understand sort of what the deal is behind all of that. Basically, the further east you go, in my opinion, their northern primordial cosmology and tradition is more out in the open with the symbolism and stuff. You know, the wheel is a good example of this too, because the axle of the wheel is that same world axis. It's the heaven can kind of be, or the night sky from the perspective of Earth, looks like a chariot wheel or just a wheel, the wheel of heaven. And so I think the wheel, the mandala, the swastika, all of these symbols, they all have a point of pivot. They all have that sacred center, which again, I think is kind of like sort of understood, little known and undervalued here in the West.
So at the turn of the century, there was an Indian nationalist named Bautalik, and he, very interesting guy. He was loved by Gandhi. He was hated by the British. So he was polarizing. But what he did was he went through some of the old Iranian passages and some of the old Vedic texts. And what he found was that there was a race of Indo-Europeans that were kind of like migrating across Eurasia that were going by Aryan. And there's a lot more to it, right? But it's very interesting. So he wrote about this. He's this Indian nationalist, and he's using the term Aryan all throughout his writings. And then later, about 34 years later, you see German nationalists start using Aryan. It's almost like they read his work and they decided we're gonna take this term now and use it. And in India, from what I understand, either it was or it still is, the swastika was like a symbol of enlightenment. And this brings me back to Carl Jung, because I mean, he brings to alchemy dreams and consciousness. And he was kind of drawn to alchemy through synchronicity and dreams. And there's this whole, I think some might say that like transmuting lead into gold, it could be seen as symbolic of the vast, heavy lead of the unconscious mind turning into a luminous, beautiful illumination of gold. Lead being this heavy sense of like self doubt, and where you want to get is to gold being self-worth. And so I think maybe there's this gold being used as enlightenment in some of these cultures as well. I think
Oh yeah.
With gold and with alchemy, the symbology is just there for the decoding.
Right, right. Well, my personal opinion of the Aryan sort of label or title, is that basically what it represents is people who have a reverence for the North and actually believed that they came from a northern location. And so there's a book called The Arctic Home in the Vedas, and it really gets into, there's a number of books actually that get into this, but this is sort of the idea. There's always, it seems like there's different sort of periods of time where people kind of get into this information, I suppose. And they start having this sort of idea that they want to go back to their homeland or something along these lines. And so it's interesting. Aryan, Arctic, right? Even I think it's connected to things like Ursa Major and things like this. And so I see this as kind of like the main thing. And not everyone who maybe identifies with that is even aware of that. But this gets into sort of the Hyperborean tradition of
Right.
people coming from the north, you know? And so the Hyperborean tradition is the polar to the solar Atlantean tradition. That's my understanding of things. And so a lot of myths have this idea of like, you know, the original people coming from the center of the earth. That's kind of a metaphor to me, to this central location, which if you look at Earth from the top-down perspective, regardless of your cosmology, it appears as though the North would actually be the center of it. And how many different stories are there about an opening at the North or an opening at the different poles and whatnot? And so this is like a really old primordial sort of understanding of things, is that we come from the North, that we're all Hyperborean, you know, in nature. And so it kind of flares up, and then, you know, there's a whole other side of it too, where people really get triggered by this kind of information too. And so it's an interesting weave though.
That the Aryan take that Baal-Talik was presenting, from what I understand, there were connections to a group of Iranian people that were connected to Hyperborea as well.
Oh yeah. I have a book here. I'd love to show it to you for like 2 seconds. It's called The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism by Henry Corbin. And there's a lot of interesting northern stuff in Islam, actually. And I was blown away by reading parts of this book. But he starts off, the first image here, this is Ursa Major and Minor. And he gets into northern symbolism and how it relates to esoteric Islam and Sufism and things like that. So yeah, it's a legitimate weave.
Did anybody come across an old alchemist, or have you ever heard of an old alchemist named Nicholas Flamel?
Just by name, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting story.
Yeah, the Philosopher's Stone, right?
Yeah, he's one of the guys in history who, if anybody figured out the Philosopher's Stone, in my opinion, it was this guy. Basically, he finds he comes across it. I mean, like, I guess like an ancient yard sale or something. Like, he comes across this ancient Jewish text, and he realizes he has something, because it's like it's a strange book, and like the pages aren't like anything he's ever seen. Like, they're not made of paper or parchment. They're made of some sort of rind, and it's got like curious colors for the time in it. And it had instructions on how to turn base metals into gold. And in the book, it's like their reasoning for doing this is like to help Jews living under Roman occupation to pay their taxes easy. So he comes across this book. The book itself descends into what they call Decknamen, which is like cryptic illustrations, basically weird pictures with allegory and decoded words and everything. But he's so taken by the book that he goes out on a pilgrimage in order to find Jewish scholars who will help him translate the text. And, you know, he faces rejection and all this and that, but he comes across an old Jewish scholar who's willing to talk to him, named Sanchez. Sanchez, his eyes grow wide when he sees the book, and he realizes, oh, this is huge. So they decided that they were going to dedicate all their time to deciphering the mysteries of this book. And it, like Heidi said, it put Flamel on this path to discovering the Philosopher's Stone. And in the late 1300s, he, with his wife as a witness, claims to have transmuted red stone into gold. And he also said he turned mercury into silver. And we can't confirm that, but something interesting happened that we can kind of track, and that's after this, he never had any more money problems. So he buys up, they said he bought 14 hospitals in Paris and other buildings. So he becomes this philanthropist who owns all this high-end property in Paris. And a lot of those buildings are still there. So this was a real guy. There are streets named after him and his wife in Paris still to this day. So it looks like, and he had a real strange headstone on his grave as well, with all of these cool cryptic esoteric pictures and like decoded messages, or coded messages, I should say. But you know, if anybody figured it out, I think it was this guy. I mean,
well, there was rumors too that Edward Kelly found the secret to the Philosopher's Stone and how to make gold, and that apparently his magic sauce was like this red dust, or this red substance, which hasn't really been elaborated on much more. But it's also interesting that Edward Kelly, and I think Edward Kelly was contemporary of like John Dee, who worked, he was like the original 007, and he helped him do all like the scrying. But Edward Kelly was also known as the cropped-eared alchemist, because back in the day, it's kind of like, at least in my area, when they neuter like stray dogs, or if it's like a male or a female, they'll clip like one ear or the other, and it's just so that a layman can tell, oh, this dog has been basically neutered some way. Well, they used to do that to the alchemists back in the day. They would clip your ear off if you like offended somebody, or if you got caught pulling like the old switcheroo on somebody that had originally employed your services. And I guess he had been known for kind of like selling snake oil to so many people that he had both of his ears clipped off, so that it was obvious when he walked in a room. It was like, whoa, don't trust that guy. You know what I mean? Like it's like seeing someone walk around in the Middle East with their hand cut off. You're like, well, that guy is going to steal something. So one of the people that is purported, most recent person, I think, was Edward Kelly, is also almost synonymous with like being fraudulent. And I think that's probably an ongoing thing. Even Paracelsus was probably called a fraud by a lot of people back in the day.
Edward Kelly, actually, that's why he died, because he couldn't recreate it couldn't or wouldn't make
the true
gold
believers
for the
would say
king.
wouldn't, right? Like he knew how,
right?
He just didn't want to divulge the secrets.
Yeah, and he ended up dying a horrific death and had his leg cut off, and it was a whole big thing. Either he survived it and had his leg cut off and jumped again, or just jumped out a window and died. Whichever one you want to pick. But they say it was because
Joseph Smith a little bit.
Yeah, right. And he swindled apparently the banks. It was for forging mortgage documents that they whacked his ears, I think, was what it actually got him in trouble, to that level anyway, that I read. But yeah, who knows?
Did they take both his ears?
They cropped them.
Yeah.
Like
they snipped the tops off.
A little bit, just snipped a little bit. Yeah.
It's a little haircut.
But, yeah.
Interesting. I didn't know about that with the ear thing. And then the leg stuff, I just have to say, because you mentioned Pythagoras earlier, isn't one of the things is that he had a golden thigh? Wasn't that said about Pythagoras?
Oh, I've heard that, although I always figured that was one of those metaphorical things too, where you said like don't eat beans, and like and there was something about don't stick an iron in the fire, but a lot of those were like deep philosophical teachings.
Exactly.
But I don't know what the golden thigh. What did the golden thigh actually represent in that context?
Well, in my opinion, it's really interesting that thigh symbolism is a thing. Years ago when I was looking into the thigh, I was kind of blown away at how many different references there are in mythology to the thigh and to leg symbolism. And from my personal opinion, what I gather with everything is that the leg, if you just isolate one leg, and the thigh by extension is a reference to the leg, it's not unlike kind of a pole. It's not unlike a pillar or a tree or something like that. So it's a point of pivot. And so I see it that a lot of times it's a reference to, once again, the world axis, which is my bias and my research and everything else. You'll notice that Mercury, a lot of the times, Mercury Hermes, it's not uncommon to see him on one foot, actually. Or the magician, like Crowley's magician card, he's like on his tippy toe, right? And so this is a legitimate sort of threat. Even behind Mercury or the magician in the Crowley deck, he has this pole right behind him. This is sort of the world axis. And the magician in the magician card, he has a wand. He's pointing it up and he's pointing it down. He's basically saying, I connect the above and the below, and I separate the above and the below. This goes back to this old sort of philosophy. This is like an Eastern sort of thing called the Great Triad, that there's actually a triune relationship between heaven and earth and man, that man himself is the true bridge between heaven and earth. So symbolically, we like separate it almost like a pole in a tent or something like that, like a pillar in the house of God, if you will. And even the Hebrew letter that corresponds with the magician card is Beth, which means like house or house of God. And so he is basically symbolically acting as like the central pillar in the house of God. But I see that we're all like that, basically, that there is a unique relationship, a Trinity relationship with heaven, earth, and you, essentially. But this relates to more world axis symbolism, because the Big Dipper, one of the main correspondences for a lot of different cultures, was that it was a thigh. It was the thigh of the bull in Egypt, or the thigh of Set in Egypt. And so you could see different sort of reliefs from the ancient Egyptian world, where they have the thigh of the bull and they're like presenting it to a pharaoh. This was significant in this ritual called the opening of the mouth ritual. Basically, it's like an afterlife sort of ritual. And this relates to the northern sky, because essentially my personal opinion is that a lot of cultures believe that their stairway to heaven was to the north. Jacob's ladder goes to the north. This stairway, this gateway to the afterlife, literally is in the northern sky to a lot of people. Even in like some Norse myths that I've read, they say that like you die and then your soul ascends to the northern sky, essentially. Because if it's along this central axis, it makes perfect sense with what I'm saying with the center. Everything emanates from the center and then also returns to the center. Once again, a torus field, so more bull cow sort of symbolism. And then there's even groups that have said that, heaven itself was sort of like a bull. It's the bull of heaven. There's even Egyptian artwork where literally it's a bull covered in stars, and then people are underneath the bull and they're literally looking at the heavens, but it's actually a cow, you know. So I see the thigh as being a reference to kind of the world axis, essentially. That's what I've come across personally. So Pythagoras having a golden thigh, very interesting. Even the main painting in Secret Teachings, Manly P. Hall's book, of Pythagoras, he's pointing at a circumpunct in one hand, and then he's holding a pyramid in one hand. So he's pointing at the center of the circumpunct. He's pointing at that dot right in the middle. Once again, the glyph for the sun, or perhaps a polar symbol that got transitioned over into being more solar over time. He's holding that pyramid. The Great Pyramid used to be called the Pillar of Enoch. The word pyramid, my understanding is that that's actually a newer word, and that pyramid symbolism is pillar symbolism. And pillar symbolism and mountain symbolism, I think, and pyramid symbolism, it's all the same thing, basically. You ascend a mountain, you're getting closer to the heavens, basically. You know, you have a pillar, it's getting closer to the heavens, pretty much. So him holding a pyramid right in front of a pillar as well, to me, is speaking to the fact that this is actually, the pyramid is a symbolic pillar, basically. And then we know the significance, or at least I'm sure you guys are aware of, especially Thomas, the pillar dynamic in Freemasonry and how big of a deal that is, and just the column itself. It goes on and on and on and on. But if you want to understand twin pillar symbolism, you have to look at the single pillar. You have to understand the single pillar first, which is number one, which is immutable, symbolic of God, true totality, true wholeness. And that is the card that the magician corresponds with, is the number one, right? It's the first card in the major arcana.
And also, I guess to tag onto that too, with the pillar and the pyramid, the same way, which is why it was notable when I talked about the Freemasons were trying to put the golden cap on the pyramid, because the capstone is supposed to never be on the pyramid because it represents that the great work is never finished. And that's also a very typical symbol in masonry, is you'll see the broken pillar where it's just like half of the pillar. And that kind of represents that like the work can never be done. Like there's always more to do, and it's always at risk of crumbling and falling back apart. It's like a constant reminder that you always have to be improving. Otherwise, like you can lose everything.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It always shows up in that weeping virgin motif.
The Weeping
Right.
Virgin, and it's got again Kronos or Saturn, Father Time is there. He's usually got the scythe. There's usually an hourglass down by their feet somewhere. And
Yeah.
again, that's to represent that, and it's like beauty. It's like the fleeting nature of life. You can't escape death, and that's where you'll see that broken pillar and that same exact symbolism.
It's one of my favorite Masonic illustrations, man. It's so beautiful.
What about
Gets me thinking.
the sacred pole that the Bible mentions? A lot of times it'll
Yeah.
mention alongside of, like, they talk about the high places where a lot of the, I guess, pagan ritual sacrifice would happen on the high places. They talk about that golden calf, and they talk about this sacred pole. And that's what came to mind for me when you're talking about poles and columns. And I know in a lot of the alchemical texts, I'll see illustrations with that, what resembles a pole.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, some people have referred to this primordial tradition as the mystic pole tradition as well. And so the pole is one of the most like primordial symbols or objects that there is, because all you really need is just a branch. A branch is synonymous with it, in my opinion. The tree is synonymous with it, in my opinion. There's a reason why the first two figures in the tarot have a symbolic pole with them. The fool has his walking stick. A lot of times, like, these archetypes or these myths, these figures that kind of represent like the wild man or the green man, the traveler, the journeyer, things like that. It's not uncommon for them to have a staff. It's not uncommon for them to have a walking stick or some sort of pole. Sometimes the fool has two poles with him, actually. He'll have a pole on his shoulder, and then he has what's called a bindle, which is like a sack for your belongings or whatever. And then he'll actually have a walking stick. And so it speaks to me a lot of this stuff with the world axis, essentially, and this central sort of pillar that connects all that is above and below. That's my personal analysis. I just did 2 videos on the full card. I got really, really into that as well, because it's such an important, potent symbol. Go ahead.
I've got another really good link to the tarot and the Fool in Gold, and that's that if you look at the Thoth tarot, like Aleister Crowley's version, which made after he died, but the Fool card in that, on the upper right side, it's actually it looks like golden wheat, but it's the golden bough. And you were talking about the branches and the poles, and the golden bough is like the most important golden branch of all time. The golden bough represented so many things, but it was kind of like the king and the princess and the kingdom. And the fool would be this foreigner that would wander into a new land on this big adventure. And on the fool card in the Crowley deck, it's right out of his grasp. He's reaching for it. And that is the whole story of reaching for the golden bough, which would be to kill the king and to take his kingdom and inherit it, which again is one of these like life, death, rebirth cycles. But like there was a whole entire book by Fraser, it's like 13 books, called The Golden Bough, which is all about this one thing, about this golden branch or this golden pole that the fool is basically destined to pull down.
Excellent, man. Yeah, that's great, dude. I need to read that at some point, by the way. It's been on my radar for like years.
Get the abridged version. It's like 700 pages. The unabridged is like 4,000 or something.
Oh my gosh.
Right on. Good tip.
What about the magician card where he's holding I mean, this might be a stretch, but it's like a wand, like a little pole up towards a tree, right? And it's got one hand up and one hand down towards the earth, almost as a nod to as above, so below. But he's turned himself into a human pole.
Yes. People
in that card.
People.
Okay.
yeah, totally.
Yeah. And I was trying to, maybe I brushed over it, but I was trying to make this connection earlier with uh, the Emerald Tablet being written by Hermes, who is considered to also be Thoth, and that's Crowley's deck, right? Thoth.
Book of Thoth. Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. In my personal opinion, Mercury, so he's the psychopomp, so he's the guide of souls, conductor of souls. He takes people to the afterlife. He travels between realms. I have a huge fondness for Mercury. It's such an important like deity and planet and like associated figures and stuff like that. It's huge because, in my opinion, really what we're looking at is a polar deity. He holds the caduceus. You have the twin serpents going up that wand. It's not unlike Kundalini energy going up your spine, but it's also not unlike how he actually gets from realm to realm. As I was saying earlier, you get there through your center, through the center, the symbolic center, and you go through this symbolic bridge, this axis between these different separate realms, and that's how he actually goes between realms. It's not unlike a serpent going up a tree, basically. So that's what I see when I see a serpent going up a tree. That's what I'm seeing is a symbol of the world axis and something going up it. But it makes a lot of sense that Hermes Mercury thought that that's actually how he goes between these realms. That's why he's the messenger. He can deliver these messages. There's actually a squirrel, I think, in Norse mythology. I always forget the name. It starts with an R, but the squirrel is kind of symbolic of the same thing. It's going up this world tree, Yggdrasil, right? And I know that squirrel is kind of symbolic of Mercury too in that pantheon.
We've hit on three things, and you just hit on two of them right there that I think would be cool, possible episodes. That would be Mercury, serpents, and Nazis.
Oh, I just thought you were going to say squirrels.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, I'm into it.
Nazi serpent squirrels. That should be the name of it.
No,
That
serpent
sounds like
squirrels.
a 90s band.
Yeah, it makes me think of Moses. He had a serpent staff.
Exactly. I see Moses as being a mercurial type figure.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's exactly what I was thinking while you were talking. Sorry, how to say that.
You mentioned Enoch as well and a connection to pyramids, and I've come across the thought that Enoch helped build the pyramids in a time sort of predating Egypt. And it's just very interesting because when you look into Enoch, there's this third book of Enoch. It's often overlooked, but what happens is Enoch does some transmuting of his own, you could say. He turns into the angel Metatron as opposed to experiencing death. And he's illuminated by these higher beings. He's given this knowledge, right? And given this knowledge, he comes back to Earth in this form of Metatron, and part of the building of the pyramids was based on Metatron's cube. And I mean, it's a huge rabbit hole, but it's basically sacred geometry that was used to build, I think, pyramids and maybe it affected Masonic culture as well throughout the ages, but it all goes back to Enoch and those pyramids. I just think that that's an interesting rabbit hole.
Definitely. Yeah. I wish I knew more about it, to be honest with you. I know Enoch is, that rabbit hole I need to go down at some point.
Yeah, it's cool. I don't know, Thomas, if you've come across Enoch, but I think even like with Freemasonry, I think a lot of that can be traced back to Enoch. And
Enoch is where a lot of the Nephilim stories always come from. Yeah. So that's a huge one. And then Enochian magic, again, linking back to John Dee and Edward Kelly, that comes derived from sort of the books of Enoch. Although my understanding of Enochian magic too is that they would use magic squares of the planets, and then they would plot different words or different things that they wanted to happen and then create sigil. Like sigil magic is essentially based on magic squares, which they themselves are based on the book of Enoch and some convoluted alchemical ways.
Yeah. It gets real interesting when you look into Edward Kelly scrying for John Dee and just all the things that took place with that. I know, Heidi, I know you're like, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And um, we may have lost Mario, but I'll just finish my thought here. But yeah, I mean, my favorite part of that is where when they reportedly were told that they smelled bad by the angels while they're
Yeah,
trying to like write
they
down
were
this
mean.
ancient
Yeah.
language, Enochian. Enochian's just a huge rabbit hole. I love that one.
The angels are like mean girls.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, just to throw that out there too, but that's what gold nanoparticles are used in sewage treatment, is to suppress bad smells. So maybe they
Wow.
just needed more gold in the room, and that would have been cleared up.
Yeah.
Or a bath or something.
Yeah. They're like, hey, it's
Mm.
funny because they call the angel to ultimately figure out how to make gold, but then the angel's like, oh, guys, where's all your gold at?
Yeah, no kidding. They're like,
Man, that's
give
a
me, I'm gonna
great.
stab you with my sword out of this book. Yeah,
That's
they were
Thomas. That's
mean.
wild, man. That gold nanoparticle stuff is crazy. I didn't know anything about that.
A lot of people didn't. I mean, even like the top scientists didn't really know a lot about the nano. And the Gamadian, I highly recommend that you just go and search nanoparticle gold Gamadian structure. It is literally, they've created nano swastikas and they're using it for like highly advanced technology right now.
Nano swastikas.
That's exactly what they are. Yeah, gold nanoparticle swastikas. They're called Gamadians.
Oh my god, it really does go back to Nazis, doesn't it, Howdy?
Actually older than that, but
Yeah,
yes,
I
they
know.
were harnessing it all.
Yeah.
There's like multiple rituals in the occult that deal with the swastika.
Mhm.
I didn't want to get too far into it because I didn't want to get too far off the beaten path. We were already in Naziville, but yeah, the OTO still does them. So, among others, but yeah. So, weird. Energy loose steel.
Gold, I guess if we were to put it broadly, or I mean, put it in all caps, I'd say gold represents all that is superior. And it's got that reputation, right? It's coveted. Uh, we've been talking about other ways outside of modern materialism that you can approach gold, but it does. I mean, it represents godliness, and all of that is superior. And I just find it interesting that we talked about gods and goddesses and Anunnaki and all that stuff, and it seems like it's a substance that is coveted by these higher entities just as much as it is earthlings. And gold just being superior, it kind of has this feel like if you're talking about gold, you're talking about something like to the max, to the extreme. It's like you could have a toilet or you could have a gold toilet, and you're not going to get any better than that. So I don't know. It's this thing that pulls a reaction out of people. And it's just this never, it's like it doesn't have a bottom. This topic does not have a bottom. And I mean, this has been great. I think we've turned over a lot of rocks. I was going to be cheesy and say gold nuggets, but we've turned over a lot of rocks.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. For sure. No, gold being, like I said earlier, like the axis is related to immutability. Sometimes the northern stars are referred to as the imperishable stars. So there's like a thing related to gold with immortality as well. That's kind of what we're getting around to with some of this, like, philosopher's stone or like the elixir of life type stuff and some of the health benefits and everything else. It's not going away, obviously, anytime soon, people's sort of opinion about gold. So yeah, it's divine, it's royal, symbolic of God. The northern sky, by the way, has also been referred to as the throne of God, the seat of God, and so I think it kind of relates to a lot of this stuff, but I really see this sort of permanence as being related to the center once again, not unlike the glyph for the sun itself with that dot right there in the middle. And when you're just talking about the dot briefly, it's symbolic of the center, but it's also symbolic of the totality of everything as well. So that's what the monad represents. The singular represents the whole as well. So the pole, even itself, looks like number one, kind of looks like the phallus, or you look at it from the top down, it's just a little dot, right? But that dot represents the point of pivot in the universe itself that everything revolves around, but also literally the cosmos as well. So there is an as above, so below, as within, so without sort of dynamic going on there, a micro and macro relationship with it.
That pole, the pole of the earth, is sometimes associated with being an astral doorway, right? For
yeah.
the coming and going of souls and entities. And I just never considered that there was a connection with gold with that. Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really consider it either until I started prepping for the show. And I'm like, oh yeah, there's a lot going on here.
We've hit 2 hours. Do you I know people have stuff to do, but I think we might be able to wrap this up unless we missed something, which I don't think we do.
I feel like one of us needs to say, it's gold, Jerry. And there we go.
There it is. There it is. Why this has been great. Thank you all for doing this. I've learned a lot. I'm gonna have to go back and listen to this one again just to drain it of all its nutrients, because there's a lot here, a lot of gold, you could say, in this episode. And why don't everybody just tell the listeners where they can find you?
Yeah, so people can find me at symbolicstudies.com. I'm all over the place, Instagram and Twitter and YouTube and things like that. But if you go to my site, that's the easiest way to find all my links.
And I'm Heidi Love. I'm everywhere podcasts are served. I do have a website now, unfilteredrise.com. I'm pretty much all over the place. And I do have a Patreon where we do 2 extra shows a month on Mormons, mayhem, and murder. So check us out. I also do a show with Paranoid American, monthly Mormon Mondays. So don't miss it.
That's me, and you might know me as Paranoid American through podcasting, but I really just got into podcasting to hawk my comic books, which I've been making for over 10 years now. And you can see all those at paranoidamerican.com. And the latest comic book is called nasacomic.com, and it's all about Stanley Kubrick directing the moon landings. So if you like that, there's some gold referenced in the book too, FYI, because, space stuff. So if you're interested in that, the whole title is Never a Straight Answer, and you can find it at nasacomic.com.
Awesome.
I'm Tim. My podcast is Sixth Sensory Podcast. You can find it at Spotify, Apple, soon to be on YouTube. And I will link everyone's stuff in the description below. So you'll be able to go below and find links to everybody who is a part of this podcast. Again, I want to say thanks to all of you. Let's do it again sometime. And thanks for listening, folks.